October 25, 1944. Dawn off Samar Island, Philippines. Through the morning haze, lookouts aboard the USS Johnston spotted the impossible. 4 massive battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers bearing down on their tiny task force like steel leviathans emerging from a nightmare. At the center of this armada sailed the Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, its 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling shells the size of small automobiles across 20 miles of ocean. Standing between this unstoppable force and the American invasion fleet was USS Johnston, a single Fletcher-class destroyer displacing just 2,100 tons, armed with 5-inch guns that fired shells weighing 54 pounds. By every measure of naval warfare, this should have been a massacre lasting perhaps 15 minutes. Instead, it became the most heroic last stand in naval history, a David versus Goliath battle that would shock the Japanese high command and prove that courage, determination, and tactical brilliance could overcome impossible odds. This is the story of how one tiny American destroyer and her Cherokee captain charged headlong into an entire Japanese fleet, fought them to a standstill, and in doing so changed the course of World War II. What happened in the waters off Samar would be remembered as the most improbable naval victory in American history, a battle so fierce that Japanese commanders would mistake the Johnston for a heavy cruiser, and so inspiring that enemy sailors would salute her as she sank beneath the waves. To understand why USS Johnston found herself facing impossible odds on that October morning, you must first understand how catastrophically wrong American naval planning had gone in the days leading up to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The largest naval engagement in history was supposed to be a carefully orchestrated destruction of Japanese naval power. Instead, it became a series of confused encounters that left American escort carriers defenseless against the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. The Japanese plan was called Operation Shogo-1, a desperate gambit to destroy American forces invading the Philippines and possibly change the course of the war. Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead the center force, consisting of 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, through the San Bernardino Strait and into Leyte Gulf, where they would annihilate American transport ships and landing craft supporting General MacArthur's invasion. To ensure Kurita's success, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lead a decoy force of aircraft carriers north of Luzon, deliberately exposing them to attack by Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. The carriers were mostly empty, their aircraft having been transferred to land bases, but Japanese planners hoped Halsey would take the bait and pursue them, leaving Leyte Gulf undefended. The plan worked perfectly. On October 24th, American submarines and aircraft had hammered Kurita's center force as it approached the Philippines. Several ships were sunk and Kurita appeared to be retreating. When Ozawa's carriers were spotted to the north, Halsey assumed the main threat had been eliminated and raced northward with his entire fleet, including the fast battleships that were supposed to guard San Bernardino Strait. What Halsey didn't know was that Kurita had resumed his advance after the air attacks ended. Under cover of darkness, the Japanese center force slipped through San Bernardino Strait and turned south toward Leyte Gulf. The only American forces standing between Kurita and the invasion beaches were 3 small escort carrier task forces designated Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. These task forces had been assigned routine patrol duties. Their escort carriers were converted merchant ships designed to provide air support for ground troops and hunt submarines. They carried obsolete fighter planes and torpedo bombers flown by recently trained pilots. Their escorts consisted of destroyers and destroyer escorts armed with light guns suitable for fighting submarines and aircraft, not battleships. Taffy 3, the northernmost task force, consisted of 6 escort carriers guarded by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The destroyers were USS Johnston, USS Howell, and USS Heermann. The destroyer escorts were USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, and USS Raymond. These 13 ships carried a total of 1,600 officers and men, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay. USS Johnston was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, a 36-year-old Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma who had overcome poverty, prejudice, and academic struggles to graduate from the Naval Academy in 1931. Evans was known throughout the destroyer force as a fighting sailor who trained his crew relentlessly and believed that aggressive action was the key to survival in combat. When Evans assumed command of Johnston in October 1943, he had addressed his crew with words that would prove prophetic. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Not a single sailor requested transfer. At 06:45 on October 25, 1944, radar operators aboard the escort carriers detected surface contacts bearing north-northwest at 20 miles range. Initial reports suggested Japanese destroyers, possibly survivors from the previous night's engagement in Surigao Strait. Admiral Sprague ordered his carriers to launch aircraft for investigation, while maintaining course toward Leyte Gulf. At 06:58, the morning haze lifted, and lookouts could see masts and superstructures on the horizon. These were not destroyers fleeing from defeat. These were the pagoda masts of Japanese battleships and the distinctive silhouettes of heavy cruisers advancing in battle formation. As the recognition sank in, Admiral Sprague transmitted a message that would become famous in naval history. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of our task group and closing at high speed. The impossible had happened. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since the beginning of the war had surprised a handful of escort carriers and their screening vessels. By every principle of naval warfare, Taffy 3 should have been annihilated within minutes. The Japanese had overwhelming advantages in firepower, armor, speed, and numbers. Their battleships could fire shells weighing up to 3,200 pounds across distances that American 5-inch guns could not reach. But Lieutenant Commander Evans had no intention of dying quietly. As Japanese shells began falling among the American ships, he ordered Johnston to maximum speed and turned directly toward the enemy fleet. His executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, asked if Evans intended to make a torpedo attack. "Affirmative," Evans replied. "All engines ahead flank. Left full rudder. All hands to general quarters. This will be a torpedo attack." What followed violated every principle of destroyer tactics. Destroyers were supposed to make high-speed approaches under cover of smoke, launch their torpedoes from maximum range, and retire immediately. They were not supposed to charge directly at battleships while engaging them with gunfire. But Evans had decided that conventional tactics would not save Taffy 3. Only the most aggressive possible action might confuse the Japanese and buy time for the carriers to escape. At 0700, with Japanese shells landing closer with each salvo, Johnston began laying smoke to screen the retreating carriers. The destroyer's 4 smokestacks poured out dense black clouds that spread across a 2-mile front, obscuring the escort carriers from Japanese gunners. But Evans was not content to hide behind smoke. At 07:05, he ordered Johnston to attack. Racing through her own smoke screen at 35 knots, Johnston emerged directly in front of the Japanese battle line. Evans had positioned his ship between the enemy fleet and the American carriers, accepting certain destruction to protect the ships behind him. Japanese gunners, surprised by the destroyer's audacious charge, shifted their fire from the carriers to this new threat bearing down on them. The range closed rapidly. 20,000 yards, 15,000, 10,000. Johnston's 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range, their shells tracing white arcs across the morning sky toward the Japanese cruiser Kumano. The disparity in firepower was almost comical. Johnston's guns fired 54-pound shells. Kumano's main battery fired 6-inch shells weighing 127 pounds. Her secondary armament fired shells heavier than Johnston's main guns. But Evans had achieved tactical surprise. As Johnston charged at flank speed, zigzagging to avoid enemy fire, her gunners poured shells into Kumano's superstructure. The Japanese cruiser, designed to fight other cruisers at long range, was not prepared for a point-blank engagement, with the destroyer firing as rapidly as possible. Johnston's rapid-fire, 5-inch guns could fire 20 rounds per minute, filling the air with a continuous stream of projectiles. At 0715, after 10 minutes of high-speed approach, Johnston had closed to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese fleet. Evans ordered all 10 torpedo tubes fired in a full spread aimed at the heavy cruisers. The Mark 15 torpedoes, each carrying a 600-pound warhead, raced through the water at 46 knots, while Johnston continued her suicidal charge. 2 minutes later, multiple explosions erupted along Kumano's waterline as 3 torpedoes found their target. The heavy cruiser's bow disintegrated in a massive blast that sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. Kumano, her speed reduced to 8 knots, and her fighting capabilities severely damaged, fell out of formation and began limping toward the rear of the Japanese fleet. But Johnston's moment of triumph was brief. At 0720, as Evans ordered his ship to retire behind smoke, the battleship Yamato's main guns spoke for the first time. 9 18.1-inch shells, each weighing as much as a small automobile, screamed through the air toward the fleeing destroyer. The first salvo missed, sending up towering waterspouts that drenched Johnston's crew. The second salvo did not miss. 3 armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate the thick armor of enemy battleships struck Johnston's unarmored hull and passed completely through without exploding. But their passage tore massive holes in the destroyer's structure, destroyed her after-fire room, and severed steam lines throughout the ship. A 4th shell exploded against the bridge, wounding Evans and killing several officers. Johnston's speed dropped from 35 knots to 17 as steam pressure fell, and damage control teams struggled to contain flooding. Her afterguns fell silent as power failed throughout the ship. Evans, blood streaming from wounds to his face and left hand, maintained control from the damaged bridge and ordered his ship into a nearby rain squall for emergency repairs. For 30 minutes, Johnston's crew worked frantically to restore their ship's fighting capability. Damage control parties plugged holes, repaired steam lines, and jury-rigged electrical connections. The engineering officer, Lieutenant J. Cozart, managed to restore partial power to the afterguns. Most importantly, the ship's main battery director was repaired, allowing accurate gunfire at long range. While Johnston fought for her life in the rain squall, the battle raged around Taffy 3. The escort carriers had launched every available aircraft and were fleeing southward at their maximum speed of 17 knots. But the Japanese cruisers, capable of 30 knots, were steadily closing the range. Within an hour, they would be close enough to finish off the American ships with point-blank gunfire. Admiral Sprague ordered his destroyers to launch another torpedo attack. USS Hole and USS Heermann charged the Japanese battle line while Johnston, still partially disabled, provided gunfire support. This second attack achieved mixed results. Hole fired all her torpedoes, but was badly damaged by return fire, and eventually sank. Heermann successfully launched her torpedoes and escaped with minor damage, but the attacks were having their desired effect. Each torpedo run forced the Japanese ships to maneuver violently to avoid the incoming weapons. These evasive actions disrupted their formation, reduced their speed, and prevented them from concentrating their fire on the fleeing carriers. Admiral Kurita, watching destroyers charge his battleships while torpedo bombers attacked from above, began to suspect he was facing a much larger American force than intelligence had indicated. At 0830, Johnston rejoined the battle. Despite her damage, Evans ordered his ship to attack the Japanese destroyer squadron that was attempting to circle around Taffy 3's southern flank. This would be Johnston's final charge, a last desperate attempt to disrupt Japanese plans and protect the remaining carriers. The engagement that followed was unprecedented in naval history. A single damaged destroyer, operating on emergency power with half her guns out of action, engaged 7 Japanese destroyers in a running gun battle that lasted over an hour. Johnston's surviving guns fired continuously, targeting any Japanese ship that attempted to close within torpedo range of the American carriers. The Japanese destroyers, confused by Johnston's aggressive tactics and accurate gunfire, failed to press their attack. Several times they approached within range to launch torpedoes at the carriers, only to be driven off by Johnston's defensive fire. Evans had achieved the impossible, using superior tactics and seamanship to neutralize a force 3 times larger than his own ship. But Johnston was dying. Japanese shells had destroyed her after-engine room, flooded her forward magazines, and knocked out most of her electrical systems. The ship was listing heavily to port and settling by the stern. At 0930, her remaining engine failed, and Johnston came to a complete stop, dead in the water and defenseless against enemy fire. Even then, Evans refused to surrender. Johnston's forward guns continued firing manually aimed shells at any Japanese ship within range. Her crew used signal flares and smoke grenades to simulate gunfire when their ammunition ran low. The sight of this battered destroyer continuing to fight, while obviously sinking, amazed both American and Japanese observers. At 0945, with Johnston listing 30 degrees and her decks awash, Evans finally gave the order to abandon ship. The crew began going over the side while their captain remained on the bridge, determined to go down with his ship. As Johnston's survivors swam away from their sinking vessel, they witnessed a moment that would become legend in naval history. The Japanese destroyer Yukikaze approached the sinking American ship at slow speed, close enough that her crew could see Johnston's battle damage and the American sailors in the water. Instead of firing a finishing shot or machine gunning the survivors, Yukikaze's captain ordered his ship to render honors. Japanese sailors lined the rails and saluted, as Johnston rolled over and sank beneath the waves, taking Lieutenant Commander Evans and 185 of his crew with her. This gesture of respect from enemy sailors spoke to the incredible courage Johnston had displayed during her final battle. Japanese naval officers later stated that they had never seen such aggressive tactics from any ship, regardless of size or nationality. Several Japanese commanders admitted they had initially mistaken Johnston for a heavy cruiser, because no destroyer would dare attack a battleship fleet in such a manner. The battle off Samar continued for another hour after Johnston sank, but the outcome had already been determined. Admiral Kurita, convinced he was facing the main American fleet rather than a handful of escort carriers, ordered his forces to withdraw. The Japanese had achieved tactical superiority, but failed to exploit it due to the confusion caused by the American destroyers' suicidal attacks. Taffy III's sacrifice saved General MacArthur's invasion force and possibly changed the course of the Pacific War. If Kurita's fleet had reached Leyte Gulf, they could have destroyed hundreds of transport ships and landing craft, killing thousands of American soldiers and Marines. The invasion might have failed, extending the war by months or years, and costing countless additional lives. The strategic implications of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japan had committed their last major surface fleet to Operation Shogo 1, gambling everything on a decisive victory that would force America to negotiate a favorable peace. The failure of this operation meant that Japan no longer possessed the naval power necessary to defend their remaining territories. USS Johnston's heroic stand became a symbol of American fighting spirit and tactical innovation. Her crew received the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy. Lieutenant Commander Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American naval officer to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation for Evans' Medal of Honor captured the essence of his heroic leadership. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the USS Johnston, in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet during the battle off Samar. The skipper was a fighting man from the soles of his broad feet to the ends of his straight black hair. But the true measure of Johnston's achievement lay not in decorations or citations, but in the tactical revolution her actions represented. Before the Battle off Samar, naval doctrine held that destroyers should avoid engaging heavy surface units except under the most favorable circumstances. Johnston proved that aggressive action by smaller ships could neutralize larger opponents through superior tactics and seamanship. The psychological impact of the battle extended throughout both fleets. American sailors gained confidence that courage and determination could overcome material disadvantages. Japanese commanders became increasingly cautious about committing their remaining heavy ships to combat, knowing that even escort forces might inflict serious damage through aggressive tactics. Modern analysis of the battle has only increased appreciation for Johnston's achievement. Computer simulations suggest that under normal circumstances, Kurita's force should have destroyed Taffy 3 within 30 minutes and proceeded to devastate the invasion fleet. The fact that this did not happen was due entirely to the aggressive actions of Johnston and her fellow escorts. The tactical lessons of the Battle off Samar influenced naval doctrine for decades. The concept of aggressive defensive action by smaller ships became standard practice in navies around the world. Johnston's charge into the Japanese battle line demonstrated that initiative and courage could overcome numerical and material disadvantages, principles that remain relevant in modern naval warfare. USS Johnston's wreck was discovered in 2019 by underwater explorers using advanced deep-sea submersibles. Lying at a depth of 21,180 feet in the Philippine Trench, she is the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed by human explorers. The condition of the wreck, with her hull number 557 clearly visible after nearly 80 years underwater, serves as a permanent memorial to her crew's sacrifice. The discovery of Johnston's wreck provided an opportunity to honor the ship and crew with the respect they deserve. The site has been designated a war grave, protected by international law and treated with the reverence appropriate for a place where heroes died defending their country. Artifacts recovered from the wreck are displayed in naval museums, ensuring that future generations will remember the tiny destroyer that charged an entire fleet. Lieutenant Commander Evans' legacy extends far beyond his heroic death. His example of leadership under impossible circumstances has inspired naval officers for 8 decades. The destroyer USS Ernest E. Evans was commissioned in his honor, ensuring that his name remains active in the fleet he served so courageously. The crew of USS Johnston represented the best traditions of the United States Navy: courage, determination, tactical skill, and willingness to sacrifice for others. They faced impossible odds with complete professionalism, fought their ship to the end, and achieved a victory that seemed tactically impossible. Their actions saved thousands of American lives and contributed directly to Allied victory in the Pacific. Today, naval historians rank the Battle off Samar among the finest examples of courage under fire in naval history. Johnston's charge into the Japanese battle line is studied in naval academies around the world as an example of how aggressive tactics, superior seamanship, and individual heroism can overcome overwhelming odds. The story of USS Johnston and her Cherokee captain serves as a reminder that America's strength has always come from the courage of individuals willing to stand up against impossible odds. In the dark waters off Samar, on a morning when the outcome of the Pacific War hung in the balance, one tiny destroyer and her crew proved that no force is truly unstoppable when faced with determined resistance. The Japanese couldn't believe that one tiny American destroyer could take on an entire fleet and live to tell about it. But USS Johnston did more than survive the initial encounter. She fought the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled to a standstill, disrupted their attack, and saved an entire invasion fleet through sheer audacity and tactical brilliance. Lieutenant Commander Evans and his crew of USS Johnston wrote the final chapter in the story of American destroyer operations during World War II. They proved that courage, properly applied, could overcome any material disadvantage. They demonstrated that aggressive tactics and superior seamanship could neutralize numerical superiority. Most importantly, they showed that ordinary sailors fighting for their country and their shipmates could achieve extraordinary things when the stakes were highest. In the end, USS Johnston did not just take on an entire Japanese fleet and live. She took on that fleet, fought it to a standstill, forced it to withdraw, and in doing so changed the course of history. The tiny destroyer that was supposed to die in 15 minutes instead fought for over 2 hours, saved an invasion fleet, and earned a place in naval legend that will endure as long as ships sail the seas.